say that every person is born twice. The second time is when you earn your place among the people forever.
Nenga etanu matakayo luyuset.
Hello, lovely people. That was a scene from Avatar, a film that, beyond its technological achievements, which we're probably well aware of, it explores deep and often uncomfortable themes: colonialism, environmental exploitation, the fight for indigenous rights. Through this fictional world of Avatar, if you're unfamiliar with it, the film draws direct parallels to real world issues such as resource extraction, displacement of native communities, and the dangers of unchecked human greed. But like many stories that tackle cultural and social issues, Avatar sparks conversation, sometimes in ways the creators may not have expected. While some see it as an important commentary on corporate destruction of ecosystems and indigenous cultures, others, a lot of them, my friends of mine, criticize its reliance on the white messiah trope, where an outsider ultimately leads and saves an oppressed group. It's a reminder that stories don't just entertain us, they shape how we see the world, and they can both challenge and reinforce narratives about race, power, and belonging. So, as we explore the theme of impact today, I want us to think about what makes an immersive story powerful. How do we design experiences that not only engage, but also provoke reflection and meaningful change? And how do we, as creators, ensure that we are amplifying voices rather than speaking for them? And I couldn't think of a better person to help us dive into this than Michaela Ternasky-Holland, a Peabody-nominated and Emmy award-winning director who specializes in creating impactful stories using immersive and interactive technology. Okay, I got to totally rave about Michaela. Michaela is one of the first directors to create and premiere a short film utilizing OpenAI's SORA platform, which screened at Tribeca Festival. As a nominee for the Producers Guild of America's Innovation Award, she is also a consultant, speaker, and thought leader who has been recognized as one of the 100 original voices of XR, that's extended reality for those of you who don't know it, and listed as one of Blooloop's 50 immersive influencers. Michaela, I'm super excited. Welcome to being immersed.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here today.
Okay, let's get started. Let's first start with like your work. Your work is centered on using immersive technology for social impact. How do you define impact in the context of immersive experiences?
That's a great question. I think obviously the word impact is very broad and it's very generalized. And so I think it's very easy for us to get caught up in things that sometimes more business oriented people might think of when they think of impact. And so I personally think about impact in a couple different ways. First, there's the up and down way of thinking about impact. So for me, the up and down way of thinking about impact is, what is the level of impact we're creating? Are we creating just awareness? Are we creating actual calls to action to ask people to step into a new understanding and take steps towards experiencing that new understanding in their actual world after they get out of the immersive experience? Are we actually asking these people to potentially continue that thought process over the course of many months or over the course of many years? So I think the layers of impact really kind of go back to like the ripple effect you have on people. And then sort of the horizontal layers of impact I think of is the different buckets of types of impact, right? So I think the one that we're all probably thinking of today is the civic and social justice form of impact, which I think you framed so beautifully with that avatar clip at the beginning of the interview. But there's also health and wellness, which I think is a huge part of impact. And then education, which I think sits somewhere amongst all of the other two buckets, but sometimes it's easier just to break education out as its own sort of species of impact, because we don't always think about how school systems and how children and young adults get impacted by the way they're being educated, and how adults themselves get impacted by the way they're being educated at higher institutions or even in their workspaces. So again, there's kind of this like up and down and sideways form. I also think that there are a lot of people who reach out to me and they're like, "Hey, Michaela, like, how can we make the biggest and best impact?" However, impact isn't the best impact for the project, especially when we're talking about using immersive technology. We have it again in this more commercialization or business oriented mindset that impact means reaching millions of people. But you can reach millions of people and not actually engage with those people or change their minds about something or help them learn about something. And so, personally, my way of talking about impact in immersive technology is quality over quantity. And that might
Yes.
not be expansive to every single story. That might not be expansive to every single experience.
Totally agree with you. I feel like this has been a conversation with, especially the business or the people that hold the purse strings, quality over quantity. Going all the way back to website where we were focused on clicks and views rather than actually the intention of the conversations that are happening. So it's fantastic to think about intention shaping impact. And I'm curious, like, I really love how you're thinking horizontal and vertical, and throwing in education there because experiential learning is like my jam. But can you give like some? Let's probably dig into some of your work because I think that will help really give some specific examples of how you are intentional in creating meaningful change. Because I feel like there's a lot with awareness, but then how do you actually really shape and change an audience to take those steps beyond being aware of these issues? Your work on the reimagined VR series is a perfect example of this. It was reviving folklore and mythology in ways that challenge traditional gender roles and narratives. So let's take a look at how this project brings diverse cultures to life in an format and see how we can use this as a fresh lens to hold intention and impact. Take a look.
We love you, Tatay.
We wish you were still with us.
We think of you all the time.
New eyes do watch over us.
Please light the buwan and guide it.
What if the darkness returns? I have to be ready.
I light it by myself so you can ignore your responsibility to this family.
I need to protect this family.
You're drowning in your own fear, Mayari.
Why is the mundo more important than us?
Look out!
See how their heartbreak bleeds. I miss you. Mahal ka namin.
Wow. Mahal is definitely an immersive media experience that elevates cultural storytelling. Michaela, tell us a little bit about what inspired this project and what kind of impact you hope it has.
Yeah. So I think what's great about Mahal, actually, as the first project to discuss, is that social impact or making impact doesn't always have to look like a pure documentary. It doesn't always have to look like a pure civic social justice movement. I think creating impact could also mean helping people see themselves in their own stories. And so that was really the starting point for me with Mahal. I grew up on young adult fantasy novels, young adult mythology novels, where I would constantly see Greek mythology, Roman mythology, Egyptian mythology told in this way where I was inspired to, start writing my own stories, and told in this way where I was inspired by these cultures and I looked up to these cultures. And growing up as a Filipino American, I just didn't see a lot of that in my day to day life. And so instead of thinking about, how can I put more Filipino faces, on in Hollywood, I kind of turned my attention to my medium of VR at the time and asked myself, how can I put Filipino faces into VR, but in a way that feels elevated for even Filipinos. And so, I got really excited when I learned that we have our own mythology. Most Filipinos don't even know about that. A lot of the work I see as the impactful side of Mahal is actually showing this project to Filipinos and Filipinos American alike, or Filipinos across the diaspora alike. And they always ask me, I didn't know we had these gods and goddesses. And that, again, I think goes back to that Avatar clip that you so beautifully used to frame this discussion. There is this history of colonialism. There is this history of violence. There is also this history of cultural erasure, which I'm now exploring using generative AI technology. But what's great about this VR experience is that it's ageless audience. So for me, that means we can impact people of all ages. I've had my 85-year-old grandfather, who's Filipino, who's the reason my family's in America today, watch this experience, all the way down to like a young 8 or 9-year-old person. So it's been really cool to see the range of impact that this project could have with such a different age group of audiences. Whether you're Filipino or not, I think people get really excited by the action and fantasy and mythology orientation of the project. And then on top of that, they're kind of learning about something they might not have ever been exposed to. And so for me, that really checks off my check boxes of impact, right? Again, we're not reaching millions of people across the world, but we've been able to reach some very specific audiences that make me really happy. One of my favorite, last aside, one of my favorite is actually we brought the experience to a museum in the Philippines, and I have this photo of all these like 8, 9-year-old Filipino kids like in the VR experience, and they're all looking up and they have these big open mouths. And I've been able to bring the project to the consulate, the Filipino consulate, and like those are always some of my favorite screenings of the project.
Let's talk a little bit about your creative choices when designing and writing this. The social and cultural themes. Philippine mythology, probably like other mythologies, is very diverse. How did you narrow in on the particular social cultural themes that you chose for this story?
That's a great question. So first and foremost, there's like you know, there's like over 300 islands, if not more, in the Philippines. It's a very big archipelago. This also means there's many different tribes, there's many different belief systems, even outside of Catholicism. And so for me, I really wanted to tell a story about anthropomorphic gods, so gods that look and sound like humans. And so that really landed me into the Tagalog mythology. The Tagalog mythology also has a lot of similarities to Greek mythology, right? You have like your moon goddess, your sun god, you have your father god, you have your goddess of the stars. And I think that's, to me, again, an impactful choice because it allows people a very clear inroad to this story without having to have all this context, right? We already have the cultural context of some of the gods and goddesses we're used to knowing about. Second, I think it's really important. Filipinos are really family oriented and driven, and that doesn't make us unique by any means, but I do know it's a very special part of our culture. And so I personally really wanted to highlight the family unit because I knew it would be very resonant. But even on a deeper personal level, I wanted to tell a story about siblings because I grew up with a lot of siblings, and I actually grew up under the shadow of grief. And I think that idea of what grief is also a very universal truth. So I think sometimes my special sauce is tell a really specific story, but always think about the universal truth you're trying to share, and you'll find that it resonates and impacts people no matter who they are.
I love that. The universal truth. I think that then it not only brings your own culture in and telling your story, but also relates to like my culture, which is very different. So speaking of family, I have to dive into skateboarding because to me, it isn't just a sport. It's a culture, a movement, a way of life. And for me, it's deeply personal because I live with a skater and some of my closest friends are part of the skateboarding community. And I've seen firsthand how skateboarding is more than just tricks and ramps. It's a language, a form of self-expression, for many, a way to navigate the world on their own terms. Yes, they are all rebels. So that's why I'm particularly excited to dive into this next one you co-curated, Michaela. Let's take a look at Recording the Ride. Okay, so we went from a VR experience to a physical space experience that you are really shaping the story on, a real world cultural movement. How does the difference, can you kind of talk a little bit about the differences between spaces and how you approach them in immersive storytelling?
Absolutely. Yeah, I like to say I don't pigeonhole myself in any form of technology or medium. Like I love what I love doing is just creating experiences for people to fall into and sometimes fall in love with. And I think Recording the Ride is a really great example of that. So this is an exhibit that's actually open for the next few days until March 16th here in New York City at the Museum of the Moving Image. And first and foremost, it wouldn't have been possible without the incredible partnership of the Museum of the Moving Image and my co-curator, Jacob Rosenberg. They were really also a part of the spinal cord that made up the main team. So I can't take credit for all of their incredible work, but I do want to say that when I think about tackling something as big as a full cultural movement, one of the things that we decided as a team was talking about where the start and the end dates would be. Like, why are we curating this specific exhibit? Why are we showcasing skateboard films in this way? And I think the story we found was the actual equipment during the late 80s through the 90s was almost this like beautiful marriage for these skaters at the time because the equipment was just hands-on enough where consumers could get their own VHS cameras, they could teach themselves how to edit on an editing deck, which was actual
Totally
editing with
remember that.
tape. Yep. And then they also were able to distribute their own VHSs, and the VHSs created a really amazing distribution system for them. So it became this perfect moment in time where anyone could really go and make their own skate video if if they were willing to kind of understand some of the technical chops, right?
Yeah.
And what we realized was even once the DVD came out, which means now things are more digital, and especially now with iPhones, the beauty and the savoriness of watching a skate video has kind of cr- turned into this like fast food quick hit when it used to be this like fine dining experience for skaters because when a company would drop a VHS it was like life changing. It showed the skateboarding community the possibilities of what they could do with skateboarding, right? It was a way of knowledge sharing. It was like people's minds would get blown, right? There's a great story about virtual reality when it screened, which is a experience from it's actually a VHS from Plan B that they just asked them to play it again because like no one could even like process the fact they had seen some of those tricks being done. And I think this is where it comes down to, like, when you're sharing with the culture, what we were really trying to do with the exhibit was not only highlight the technology but also the artists behind the technology. And so when I think about designing that space, we knew it was going to be very artifact heavy. We're showcasing clothing, we're showcasing decks, we're showcasing VHSs, we're showcasing CRTs, we're showcasing those editing decks, film cameras, film strips. Like, it was very physically busy for the eye. And so when we were making design choices with the team, we wanted to find a way to have the experience feel very unique to each of these companies and unique to each of those companies' flavor, while still having there be a very clear through line for the design. So two quick design things we decided. We were going to play with angles. So there's a lot of angles you'll see if you go back and watch that video, even just the way we oriented some of the signs. There's a
Nice.
lot of angles even in the signage, just to kind of give it this feeling of movement. Even the VHS stands, when the VHSs are up, they're on an angle. So angles were a big design process that was played with. And then another one was this complementary feeling of whiteness. So the white sort of is the rawness of the gallery space. And then we allowed splashes of color and splashes of big pieces of assets to really come out to you. And I think if we had decided to design the space differently without there being sort of this clean whiteness in the space, it would have felt too busy, right? It would have been very easy to fall into this kind of urban mindset around we need a park bench or we need a spray paint. And the reality is, like, that doesn't also express skateboard storytelling. Like, skateboarding can happen anywhere. It just happens to be we're highlighting street skateboard, but there's still ramp experiences in these VHSs. There's still like these skaters doing things on neither street or ramp. They're kind of just like messing around with each other. And so I think the beauty of the experience overall is those key design elements that tie the whole exhibit together while still celebrating each of the uniqueness and each of the diversity and creativity of each of these amazing companies, filmmakers, and skaters.
Yeah, I love it. It's something I try teaching my students is about constraints, right? Like, it gives you so much freedom once you do those constraints. So hearing that you picked two and you repeated that repetition in the space whether it's a digital or a physical one, is super important. And so storytelling, I think what's interesting about immersive is that it's not a passive experience. The audience is at the center. So let's take a moment and hear from you, the audience, our being immersed community. We're going to post a question here, and it's called, what's the most important, most powerful immersive experience you've ever had? Maybe it was a movie like Avatar or a virtual reality piece. Maybe you know of Michaela Ternasky-Holland's experiences, and that was one of your most powerful one. Think of anything that's changed the way you think or feel about something, because I believe that really incorporating impact into immersive storytelling is that you walk away changed. And drop your responses into the live chat. And while you're at it, if you have any questions for Michaela, add those too, and we'll revisit your responses and your questions later in the session. So, jumping back, Michaela, one of the most powerful ways immersive media can create impact is by fostering empathy and emotional resonance, right? Placing audiences directly into the lived experiences. I think storytelling, and clearly you are a storyteller and you know how to create constraints and think about kind of the cultural nuances of story. But what does it take to design a piece that doesn't just inform, truly immerses the people in a reality that changes how we think and feel? Your project On the Morning You Wake does exactly that. Let's take a look at it.
On the morning you wake to the end of the world, take your body back to the kai, to the place our kupuna taught us life began. First pole, then coral, then slime, then a whole universe fitting into a space smaller than a grain of sand.
911, please, fire ambulance. I just got an alert on my phone saying there was a ballistic missile inbound. Yeah, we just got it too. As much as you know, that's how much we know.
Pacific Command has detected a missile threat to Hawaii. A missile may impact on land or sea within minutes. This is not a drill. If you are indoors, stay indoors. If you are outdoors, seek immediate shelter in a building. Remain indoors well away from windows.
On the morning you wake to the end of the world, your vision will be 2020. So use it. And maybe, just maybe, the world may not have to end again tomorrow.
Wow. So here you immerse viewers in this terrifying experience of the 2018 false ballistic missile alert in Hawaii. This project is not just about witnessing a historical event, it's about feeling the uncertainty. Like I feel when I was watching it or participating in it, the fear, the urgency that people experienced in those critical moments. So how do you do that, Michaela? How do you balance emotional intensity to ensure that an audience is deeply engaged, but intensity creates tension, and that sometimes it can make people feel overwhelmed. How do you do that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I personally think when it comes specifically to virtual reality, which is On the Morning Wake is a gorgeous virtual reality experience, my role was really thinking about how do you put people in the headset and how do you take them out, right? So I came in as the impact producer and this creative strategist because they knew nuclear weapons threats not the easiest thing to talk about. And so for me, especially with VR, I think about VR almost like a ritual and how you set the audience up to go through the ritual and how also do you bring the audience back into their world? How do you reintegrate them? How do you give them aftercare? How do you make sure after they've gone through this potentially transformational experience of being in this VR headset, living these realities that you've so poetically laid out, how do you make sure they feel like they can reconcile that without just throwing them back into the reality that they live in?
Yeah.
And I think that a lot of that had to do with the fact that, this is still very top of mind, but at the time was also very, very top of mind.
Mhm.
And I think that the beauty of what we were able to do was we were able to think about ways that we could set people up to know what they were about to do. I think one of the critiques I have for my fellow colleagues sometimes in VR is that they just tell people the title and then they throw somebody in the headset and they have no idea what they're about to do or see. And so we very clearly told everybody, like, this is what this is, the content warning, trigger warning, do you still want to do this? And people would verbally say yes or check a yes box on the screen. So then at least you're kind of preparing them. You're also making sure they feel comfortable in the headset. I think so often people put people in headset very haphazardly, and they don't realize the physical intimacy of VR, and it being on your face is actually a huge, if not 80% of the actual experience. You know, the content is almost at 20%. If
Yeah.
that headset doesn't fit well, if it's blurry, if you're feeling like, you know, you're getting nauseous because whatever you're seeing feels a little crooked, like there's all these nuances that VR is at its best, and you're making your best impact when people are comfortable, right? And what's great about On the Morning Wake is that it's seated, it's not interactive as much, it's more immersive. So we were able, again, very similar to Mahal, see a big range of people come through the experience. But once they got out of headset, I think the most important part was the aftercare piece. You know, a lot of people came out and were very impacted. And especially when we were in a more public setting, we tried to make sure people felt like they had a private space they could go to if they needed it. We would often give people an iPad that would help them kind of decompress and come down from the experience, that asked a lot of questions, but also asked them if they wanted to get involved in this issue. And I think that's the biggest part, right? It's so easy to leave people going, okay, what now? Like if there was a person that survived Hiroshima who also survived the false ballistic missile alert living in Hawaii, like this is all like happened so recently, and what now? And then you hear all these government officials talk about it, you see all the big plumes of smoke, and you hear about the devastation possibilities. And so instead of leaving people feeling like, okay, I'm hopeless and I'm helpless, you give them the opportunity to get involved. And that's sort of taking part in that action piece. So we would say, hey, what level do you want to get involved in? Do you want to get involved in the racial justice level, the climate change level, the environmental safety level? Do you want to get involved in your local? And they would, as they would kind of click through the answers, it would then lead them closer and closer to an organization that we had selected. And then if they wanted to, they could give us their cell phone number and we could text them that organization link, so that there was kind of this reminder, even after they were going about their day, that they could look up this organization, get involved, or at least know that there was somebody out there fighting this issue. And I think that's a really important part of creating impact as well, because you can focus really, really, really hard on the content. But if you're not thinking about the way that you're ramping your audience into the content and then, or story, content or story, I know content's a very heated word these days, and the way you're ramping them out of the story and the content, then the content or the story is going to fall somewhat flat. And I think that was my proudest achievement with On the Morning Wake, as with a couple other parts of that project. But my proudest achievement was, I don't think we ever had anyone walk away and just be like, that was terrible and the world is terrible. Even if they came out of the headset, they were crying, they were upset. By the end of the aftercare experience, I think they all walked away feeling at least like they could have taken small actions or taken their own kind of activism into their own hands.
And did you actually track the type of activism that followed that in the offboarding? Because I'm wondering about how VR's ability to evoke strong emotional resonance response compared to traditional media. Are you seeing a higher return on really getting active and not just building awareness, but active change, or feeling like they can participate more?
That's a great question. So I think for us, we were also interested in that same question.
Yeah.
So instead of tracking what happened after those people left, what we tracked instead was a comparative media study where we took a 2D version of the exact same experience in VR, put it on an iPad, and then we did the exact same experience in VR, and we gave them each the exact same onboarding and aftercare. And what we saw was a huge drop off of people who felt hopeful, who felt like they could take action, who even took the steps to give us their cell phone number to get connected to the organization. The difference between those who felt that in the iPad versus those who felt that in the VR, there was a staggering difference. And what we also found was the emotional heightenedness that people felt in VR, whether negative or positive, led them to want to get more involved, and also led them to feel like the experience was more enjoyable than people who were in 2D.
Yeah.
So we saw a direct correlation of 2D versus immersiveness in that comparative media study that we did.
I think it's great you did a comparative media study. I feel like it's in line where we're probably already so blurry with doom scrolling and everything. And, like now everything is streaming on 2D flat screens. So, I don't even remember the show I binged a week ago. But like you in VR, you're transporting people to somewhere else. So there's this real sense. But there's a paradox to it too. The movement of you putting on a headset, you isolate from people around you. While it's a ritual of strapping in and adjusting the fit and shutting out this external world, the headset, it seems like it's an entry point, but it also could be a barrier, right? And your project Face to Face explored that tension. It played with intimacy, creating a sense of blindness, while keeping people physically present in the same space. Can you unpack that a little bit about Face to Face? What did you do differently there than other ways you've played with VR experiences in a headset?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think with face to face, one of the first things we did was we actually created our own virtual reality headsets. We didn't use just the out of box Meta Quest headset or HTC Vive headset. And the reason we did that is because the story itself is about a woman who wears a facial prosthesis. And so instead of thinking about how the technology could fit into the story, we thought about how the story could fit into technology. And I think that's really important because when you're thinking about creating a certain ambience or a certain energy, and not everybody might pick that up as an immersive designer, not every audience member is going to be attuned to that energy you're creating for them,
Oh my God,
but
I would
especially
totally be geeking out on there.
but I think especially with face to face, which was a physical installation that took you through the reconstruction of her home. You first were in this like escape room, like living room space where you were opening things and learning things about her life, almost like a prologue. Then you went into the bathroom and you put on this facial prosthetic VR headset, which showed you her life in a deeper way. You also got her backstory of why she wears a facial prosthetic. You kind of got to see inside of her mind of being someone who's blind, of being somebody who is a mother and a daughter, as somebody who's been a victim of severe trauma. And so you were able to do it in this like very intimate way. But yeah, I think one of the beauties of this experience is that the person that we were championing in this project, because the goal of the project, and I think this goes back to that avatar clip, is about where the power sits. And I think
Right.
oftentimes when we're talking about people who experience trauma, we often look at them from a downward angle, whether that's in documentary or in media or even in some of these more like avatar-esque kind of experiences. And when you look at them as this like external downward angle, you actually are not connecting with them. You're kind of like seeing them as this is disempowerment. And I think we're going to see that in one of the other projects we talk about. And so the goal of face to face was sort of to level that power hierarchy so that you're looking at her like an equal. And so what we set up, the ambience and the energy we set up is you're a guest in her home, right? And actually, after you get out of the VR experience, you step into her kitchen and she may or may not be there to have a quick chat with you. And that's really was going back to that idea of equaling out the power hierarchy and making sure that instead of you looking down onto her, you were looking at her from this equal level. And I think the VR headset making you blind, the VR headset allowing you to go into her world is a huge part of creating that ambience too, because now you're not learning about you're not learning about her and her trauma from the outside in, but really from the inside out.
Got it. Got it. Okay, so that's interesting. It seems like this balance of, I'm curious. You've done some that you can actually, if I have a VR headset at home, I can actually go and watch it. But then this one seemed like it was embodied in a bigger physical space with onboarding and offboarding. Do you have a preference, or like from a creator perspective, do you find one is more impactful than the other, or they both serve a purpose?
That's a great question. I think they both serve a purpose. Again, it depends always on the environment, you know?
Yeah.
The fact that somebody could just stumble upon an experience like On the Morning You Wake or Body of Mine because they put on a VR headset that they got from Walmart and they're just scrolling through their apps is a really beautiful serendipitous thing, right? Versus I think somebody who's like paid a ticket or somebody who has come to come to an event or a project with sort of an expectation that they're going to be given the best version of that product or that project possible. Of course I would, neurotic wise for me, I would love to have full control over the onboarding and aftercare and give somebody a fully immersive physical
Me too.
experience. That's just, I think my background with Disney has taught me that. But I also think there is a very wonderful, beautiful power of somebody, Alice in Wonderlanding, falling into a rabbit hole they weren't expecting that day. And
Yeah.
and so sometimes I do think it serves a joint purpose in creating the impact you're trying to create, dependent on the story. I think while Face to Face is a beautiful 360 documentary, you could probably watch it in a VR headset. I don't think you would get the same resonance and the same emotional connection as you would if there wasn't the physical installation around it.
Yeah.
And I think, again, that power balance that we were talking about would actually be a bit skewed, which is why we've never released that VR documentary more widely.
And goes back to your quality versus quantity, and being able to really choose which needs a broader audience versus which needs that more intimate experience. Let's go into another one of your VR experiences. Your VR documentary, Lutao, created as part of Meta's VR for Good program, highlights the struggle of children in the Philippines who must navigate treacherous waters just to get to school. So, this story is an example of how immersive media can highlight real world challenges and inspire change. Let's take a look at that. So tell us a little bit about this story. How does it inspire action beyond awareness?
Yeah, great question. This I think is a great example of how like just an out of the box tech is sort of a great methodology for certain for certain issues. It's a great solution. So I think for Lithao, which is again for the MetaVR for Good platform, you are partnered with a company. You are given this kind of mandate as a creator to make an experience that will help resonate with the audience that the nonprofit is trying to reach and raise money for,
Mm.
right? Like there's kind of a clear mandate there, and it can create impact. And I think the first thing with Litao that I love is that instead of thinking about creating another poverty porn piece, which I think is very easy to create in VR, you can just take a camera, stick it somewhere, show all of this horrible poverty, and then say, please, please pay.
Yeah.
Again, I think what that creates is this uneven power hierarchy, right?
Mhm.
Where people are looking down on other people are othering other people, even if it's for a good cause, even if they're willing to spend money, you're creating this disconnect versus this connection. And I think making the decision, me and the director, Samantha Quick, decided to make the decision to turn this project into animation. And we decided to take an inspiration point of these incredible children in Cebu who swim or walk to get to school and create these sort of pseudo version characters of these children. So Jeremy and Isco are a sister and a brother, very similar to any sister or brother, whether they live in a high rise in Manhattan or they live in Cebu on an island. A sister and a brother, sometimes they get along, sometimes they don't get along. And that's really the relationship building in the project. And then Jeremy's major conflict as a character is how am I going to get to school without continuing to wet my homework as like a very bright young person? So what we see her go through is she's innovating and inventing all these different ways to get to school. And of course, because of Isco and sometimes because of Jeremy, they don't always work. And then together they decide to build a little yellow boat, which is inspired by the Yellow Boat of Hope organization, which builds little yellow boats like little yellow school buses for these children who swim to school. They also provide schools, they provide education materials. It's a very holistic aspect. But again, I think thinking about the production design, we didn't shy away from the poverty. We just didn't make it the highlight. So when you watch the VR film, everything you see is actually accurate to things that were seen in Cebu and architecture and items that you see in Cebu. All of that is all very much based in real world. But I think bringing it into this animated immersive world, bringing it into this human connection where you see this heroine, Jeremy, trying to get to school. How is she going to do it? Isco as this little antagonist. I think you start to find yourself feeling like, oh, these are kids just like any kids. They just have these hurdles they have to overcome. And so while I'm not as fully aware of what impact the VR project has made for the nonprofit, I do know we worked very hard from our end as a production team to one, hire at least half the talent from the Philippines. And so we hired a score composer and an animation studio. So 75% of our American budget went back into the Philippines, which I think is this very important part of impact. I think where your money is going and how your money is being spent, whether that's to invigorate a certain market, whether that's to teach a certain talent pool, is one of the important decisions you can make as a producer and a creator. And
Mhm.
then second, we wanted to make sure that a VR headset actually got to the Philippines so these children could see the VR experience that was inspired by them. And so for me, those were like my two goals of impact. And then whatever the nonprofit continued to do with the VR experience is totally up to them. So I'm really excited because I think Latau it puts together a great model of telling a story, different power levels for a nonprofit, which I know can be very difficult to do. So it's very equal in that way. Second, the talent we hired, I think, are outstanding and they happen to be Filipino, which is awesome. And then third, these kids have access to the same technology that is being used to tell their story.
Mhm. I absolutely love it, and I think you're really resonating with, like, teaching the next generation how to work with real world clients, not taking it at face value of, like, if you're working with a nonprofit, you have to, like, just do a documentary style. You bring your creativity and innovation to it, and your story is beautiful along with not only talking and sharing this, story of Lithal, but also, thinking about how they're problem solving and innovating. So it's kind of again kind of goes back full circle to what you said of like creating those like bigger threads that any community can hook into on like how do you experiment? How do you innovate? How do you when you have a challenge, what goes through? I mean, that's my teacher coming out on me like, "Oh, I could create a lesson plan all on this."
Yeah, and what by giving those characters in the VR experience agency to solve their own problem, you're
Yes.
also seeing them as these non-helpless people. Like, especially when you talk to these kids, they don't know they're in poverty, right? They also like their dreams are to become an astronaut and come back and share their experiences on the moon with their community. Their dream is to become a professional athlete and come back to their community. Like they were so community oriented what we saw too on a trip to the Philippines. I think that was really important to like bring that energy and essence into the story.
Yeah, and your intentionality of giving back to the Filipino community all the way down to being a creator and a producer and hiring people that, I think is super important. I don't think I'm doing it, but like Texas Immersive is, we call it the TXI Queens because it's all female run and creators and everything. And there's something about that, like really kind of helping to build the community up, is important. Let's talk a little bit about your Cha Cha Immersive Festival, something that's near and dear to my heart because I spent some time this summer in Japan. So the whole idea of ritual in the tea ceremony, having worked with the master of tea ceremony is really interesting. And it's multi-sensory, which is my jam when it comes to immersive experiences, is really creating a multi-sensory design. This festival really invites audiences. Is it still going on right now? I think it is.
It just closed on Sunday.
Closed.
I know, it just closed.
Well, it definitely seemed like it was a great connection of taste, touch, and tradition. So let's take a look at that.
Embrace the truth of who you are, for it is in that revelation that you will find your strength.
Embrace alliances. They will guide you through the challenges ahead.
So this one is definitely a cultural story that's more tangible and participatory. It seems like it was a collective of people working together. Can talk a little bit about the techniques or the choices you make when creating a more multi-sensory experience.
Yeah, great question. So, just to help frame the umbrella of it all, so the Cha-Cha Festival is the first ever festival that celebrates tea here in New York City, and it's created and organized by an incredible leader in our community called Karen Wong. And so Karen Wong worked with the space called WSA, and what they did was they commissioned 5 artists to create these immersive tea houses, and each artist has their own vertical of what they design. And so some furniture artists created a really cool fountain that was all about washing tea leaves. An incredible artist created an immersive chai tea house that was all about explaining, feminization of chai and bringing females into spaces that were predominantly male when chai tea is kind of a big predominant part of certain cultures. An incredible architectural group created these gorgeous umbrellas and meet and greet spaces that was inspired by Hochija. And so we were the oolong tea house, and sorry, give me, sorry, I had to sneeze.
You need some
And
tea.
I know. I know. It's just starting to warm up in New York after a very long, cold winter. So I think I'm kind of feeling that little bit of allergy. But anyway, so the oolong tea house, which was kind of commissioned to me and my co-creator Erin Santiago, our vertical was creative technology and immersive design. And so we were given this incredible dark room space, and we were paired with an oolong tea vendor. So again, this goes back to maybe working with a client or a dining experience. We knew that we had to incorporate tea, and then more specifically oolong tea, into our experience. So again, we were given these really beautiful constraints that really helped us focus in on our design setting. And so knowing we had a dark room, knowing we had a great oolong tea vendor, what we also found out was that oolong tea vendor does this very bespoke 5 flavor tea tasting of oolong. We also learned that oolong is a high elevation tea, which means you have to harvest the leaves and grow the leaves at a certain elevation. So there's this mountain in Taiwan. This is why Taiwan has such incredible teas, because of their mountain ranges. So we learned about the mountain range. We also learned that oolong tea gets roasted. So we took all of that into our little brains, and we kind of started to squish it around and think about ritual and think about immersive design. And the first thing we knew is we wanted there to be this really bespoke, personalized moment that was optional. And we also knew we wanted this to be a very high traffic social space that also allowed there to be contemplation. Because we knew the festival was going to see over 500 people every few hours, we knew we would have a big stream of people walking in and walking out. So what we designed was this kind of recreation of a tea house where people could sit and watch the screen, which allowed people to kind of take a moment to contemplate, to reflect. And then we had this white table, which allowed people to get their tea leaves read. So people would come
That was
in
an
with tea.
optional choice.
Exactly.
Got
The reading is optional. So people could come in with their tea, and they could sit and they could watch the screen, which was actually inspired by the mountains in Taiwan. And they could listen to the audio landscape that was also inspired by mountains. They could hear our score landscape. But then, if they felt like they wanted to, they could watch other people get their tea leaves read. They could also step up and offer their cup for a tea leaf reading. And it didn't have to just be a cup from our oolong vendor. It could have been a cup from anywhere. And so people would place their cups down, and they would get a really bespoke 25 to 30-second reading from what we were calling the oracle. And there was this really cool kind of activation mode where the whole space would kind of light up in a specific way, and the projections would change so everyone knows somebody's about to get a reading. There was a whole reading experience, and then it would kind of all swirl away back into what we call the waiting state, waiting for another reading. And it was wildly successful.
Curious about the readings really quick. Was there a line? Did you feel like people were waiting to get it, or you didn't worry about that?
I think that's what I loved about the design of it, because dependent on the types of crowds we would get, some people would queue and wait for a good 5 to 10 minutes in the queue. And then some people would just sit and stand, and it was almost like a meditative ritual where people would just get up when they felt ready and put their tea down, and very respectfully would like look around the room and see who looked like they wanted to put their tea down. Sometimes 2 people would get up, and there had to be this like quiet social interaction, eyes and shoulders and body being like, oh no, you go, no, you go, right?
Yeah.
And I kind of love that. I think leaving a little bit of serendipity in immersive design is what creates these really beautiful moments. And so there was definitely a queuing system when people felt they wanted a queue. And it was interesting because we found like some more of the more anxious, energetic, like people being like, oh, I just want to get this done would start to create the queue. And then the people who are kind of being there being like, oh, we just want this experience would start to sit, and then they would kind of change the queue, or the queue would start to form like naturally. So it was very interesting, but people would just sit there. Some people, I had one person sit for 2 hours in the space and never get a reading. They just sat and watched the readings.
Wow, that's so cool. That's really cool. I love the whole idea of the social interactions that can kind of serendipitously offer. And so we've talked about a lot of different of your projects, which are all amazing. I'm curious, what are some as we kind of close up, what are some of your biggest challenges in making immersive impact storytelling both accessible but also financially sustainable?
Great question. So I think immersive storytelling being accessible is the reality is there's never going to be a perfect level of accessibility, and you just have to kind of remember that. So if the purpose of the project, like On the Morning You Wake, is to get as many people in the world to see it, then you're probably going to want to publish your experience to the MetaQuest platform. You're going to want to have a big impact campaign. You're going to want to tour it to around the UN, Nobel Peace Center, universities, high schools, right? There's a very clear, like, our goal is, even though VR is not very accessible in certain ways, to get this as accessible as possible. And that very much is like a very specific energy. Versus something like Cha-Cha is very accessible once you have a physical space, but then you're asking people to come travel to the physical space. And so my dream would be to bring Cha-Cha to a more commercial, a more commercial brand, and be like, hey, let us activate your space in your next big conference, or let's activate like your brand space, right? Like I would love to bring Cha-Cha in all these different ways to different people, but that's a whole different model of almost like touring. So I think
Which is
making
still
it
trying to figure it out, because a lot of mine are physical spaces as well, and they're not fitting in the traditional festival norm. They're like, you're a little different, so
right.
things to still figure out.
Yeah, and I think that's kind of the reality of accessibility. And then we're not even talking about like accessibility justice, right? Like
Yeah.
putting on a VR headset for someone with like less mobility than somebody else, or
Or
like making
sight
something
with
accessible
glasses.
for sight. Yeah. Or even something like Cha-Cha, like it's pretty accessible, but we don't have closed captions, for
Yeah.
somebody who might not be able to hear their own reading, right? So I think there's all these layers of other accessibility, but I think the accessibility you're talking about is accessibility to the public.
Mm.
Um, and the reality is like that's okay, because again, it's quality over quantity sometimes. So if I'm trying to reach a certain audience, like the Cha-Cha Festival audience, I did my job. If I'm
Yep.
trying to reach the nonprofits audience, once I, give them the final project, I did my job, right? Like I
Mhm.
think the feeling of having to reach everybody is always going to be an impossible task. And I love that, because the power of immersive design is about the people that you find, right? It's the people that find you as well. And
Yeah.
I think there needs to be intentionality with that audience. And I think this idea of like, if I reach every single person in this square radius, like you also could be saturating your ability to create impact, because you're not being as specific and poignant as possible.
Yeah. Yeah. That's really, really important to consider and everything. So, okay, let's revisit our opening question. Some of you shared amazing immersive experiences that impacted you, and I've got a few right here. Hold on, let me take my glasses off so I can read them. Like complete opposite. Here's what they're saying, Michaela. What's the most powerful immersive experience you've ever seen? Impulse at South by Southwest, the ADHD. Oh my God, I cried at that. I actually remember crying at that one. Some of the social justice documentaries on Netflix have been really impactful for me. Based on what they've been sharing, how do you think these personal experiences reflect the power of immersive media?
Yeah, I mean, again, like when even if you can remember a VR experience, that's in of itself its own impact, right? That means it's created a memory. I like to say, if I create a very successful experience, then I've created a memory, and if I've created an experience that it has impact, then I've created a transformational experience, right? I've created this like transformation for you, and yeah, I think that's just a testament to not just immersive media, but I think just immersive landscapes, right? Like social impact aside here, we live in a 360 3D world. Like we just do. Like we didn't grow up in a 2D non 360 world. So I think when you think about spaces like theme parks, when you think about spaces like universities, museums, your own personal home. Like, you're constantly being in these immersive spaces that can create these changes inside of you. And I think media allows there to be a second or separate layer that you can fall into. But I also think sometimes, like, sometimes you watch a VR experience and you forget about it. You might watch something else in this other environment, like a movie theater or on your own couch, and you'll remember it, right? And sometimes I can't help but think about the permeance of the actual spaces you're in or the people you're seeing this with. That's the power of media, also, is like talking about it and sharing it with people who have also seen it, or who haven't seen it.
Yeah, the people and the stories and the places we live within. I think I talk about space versus place, and how place is really imbued with story and imbued with people, imbued with our cultures and what the meaning is. And I think that's what makes an immersive experience. There's a few questions from our audience that I'd love to share with you. As an impact consultant, how do you choose what projects to focus on?
That's a great question. So really it depends. A lot of projects come to me and the project's not finished yet. And I think that's a really hard place to be in, because again, if I'm coming in as an impact consultant, I can't consult with you about the impact your project could have until I see the impact. Like, I could maybe connect you with some organizations that I think are aligned. So one big part about it is people will come to me, the project's not done. I'll tell them some helpful things potentially that I think could be connective for them, but I usually tell them to come back once the project is finished, or close to finished, because impact is different than production. I think oftentimes they almost need to be treated as two different productions, right? So I think oftentimes they can get conflated together. Um, I think this is a difficulty I have in general, because I think the work I do is not specific to me. So my dream and my goal is to actually be a part of or help create some sort of impact for XR or impact for immersive workshop or course, so more people can just learn about my strategies and other successful people's strategies. Because I don't think I should be, yeah, I don't want to be a I
Are
don't
you
want to be a
hinting at
stopgap.
becoming a new course at Texas Immersive Institute?
If they want that, I'd be down. Honestly, I've been like talking to a lot of people about this, because the
Yeah.
reality is like, I don't want the things in my brain to be only in my brain. I want to share them so that more people can think about how they can create impact. And then I, as an impact consultant, can work on specialized things and not feel like I'm saying the same things over and over again to many different projects.
Right, right. And what are you working on next? Can you share?
Of course. Yeah. So, generative AI has been a big part of what I've been involved in the last few months. This goes back to that financial stability or financial sustainability conversation. I don't have a very specific medium I work in, so I always try and figure out ways I can make things happen as an artist, as a creator, as somebody who's trying to be as ethical as possible. And I'm of the mindset that if something scares you, then it's either new or it's something that you are excited by. Right. And there are things that are scary in the world, but I think something new like generative AI, there's a lot of things to be hesitant about, but there's also a lot of things to jump into and just explore so you can understand the barriers and the stopgaps of this technology. And so I'm working on another generative AI short film right now with the platform that helped me with my last generative AI film, which is Dreamflare. I am working on another immersive installation with Erin Santiago called Kapwa, which we have been doing, but we're doing a totally new iteration potentially for Greece, and a new festival in Greece. And I am currently working on co-curating a new exhibit with the Museum of the Moving Image, which I can't say anything quite, but it is about immersive media, which I'm very excited. So those are just a couple of things I've been working on, and as well as consulting on a few impact campaigns and consulting on a few VR animated films.
And last question, what advice would you give to creators looking to craft experiences that have a lasting impression and create change? Where do I begin if I'm a new creator?
I think you begin with yourself, right? It's so easy to get like really caught up in like what everybody else is doing and what works. And I think you need to find your own taste and flavor as an immersive creator, right? Like, just because everybody's doing X doesn't mean that resonates with you. And you need to recognize that, and you need to be like, okay, that's cool, but that's not me. Because the biggest thing I think is so important when you create work is the earnest authenticity.
Mm,
Um, and your earnest authenticity does not have to look like this other person's earnest authenticity. Because if you're trying to create stories or experiences that resonate with people, again, I think it goes back to finding those specific stories that you are so excited to tell. Because these things are not easy to make, create. It is not as glamorous as people might think. I was just at Chacha's space today, like literally taking apart speakers and putting boxes and like it's not super glamorous, right? But
Yeah.
you create these experiences because you love them. You have to say, what is that specific story that I love so much that I'll put time, energy into? And then what is that specific story's universal truth that people could feel what I'm trying to tell them? And I think that's where every great project comes from, from as big as the Disneyland sort of empire that it is to as small as something like Cha-Cha or something like Asleep No More or something like a small immersive theater thing you might see or a LARP. These all come down to, I think, this intentionality around wanting to share something.
That's amazing. Well, Michaela, this has been an incredible conversation. Your work is a testament to how immersive storytelling moves and inspires and drives real change. So thank you for sharing your insights with us today. And to
Thank you for having me.
Oh, thank you. And just to our audience who's listening here today, if you love today's discussion, make sure to follow Michaela's work. We're going to post her socials here, including Texas Immersive Social, so you can follow us too to keep exploring the power of immersive storytelling. And don't forget, this live stream will be available at Texas Immersive's YouTube channel, where you can find more deep dives into the immersive media space as I unpack all the principles of immersion. So until next time, stay curious, keep engaged, and making great impact. Bye, y'all.
Bye.